And it's just gone 12 o'clock, so I can say good afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Glad you're here. Delighted to be able to welcome you to the second session of the Learning Technologies Autumn Forum for this year, the second of the virtual sessions that we've got running. And thank you for, if you did join us earlier, for contributions earlier on. If you didn't join us earlier, you missed a great session, which will be available to catch up with tomorrow. But delighted you're here today. Please do say hello in the chat. I'm pointing this way because this is where I've got my chat box. Really interesting from the first session today, we were talking about future technologies, and delighted to have the opportunity to be able to introduce Helen and Mark from Thrive today as well. As much as because when they were looking at learning technology in the May 2023, they picked up about 20% of all the sessions on the floor were talking about AI. And I think it's really interesting that we asked the question in the earlier session today about learning technologies and what's the biggest technology, and probably 80 or 90% of the responses said they were AI related. So fabulous to have the opportunity to chat it through with Mark and with Helen now. Just a reminder to people, we use the chat a lot, so please make sure you're putting your comments in the chat. You'll notice there's a tab in there that also says questions. Please put your questions in there for Helen and Mark, and we'll pick those up at the end. And there is also a poll tab as well, and there's a couple of poll questions which we'll come to, and we'll point you in the direction of those when we come to it. But you don't want to hear me, you want to hear from Helen and Mark. So over to you, Helen and Mark.
Thank you very much, and yeah, it's wonderful to be here, and it's an exciting topic to be talking about, as you say. I've got a thing to play with and zoom around with, so this is going to be fun. So we'll get that ironed out and we'll smooth that out. My name is Mark Ward. I'm co-founder here at Thrive, and I'm joined by Helen, who's our Chief Learning Officer. And yeah, as we were just saying, AI is very much a hot topic at the moment, but it's also one that has, I think, inspired a lot of confusion. There's a lot happening with it, and every time we have a conversation about it, there's so many different points of view, there's so many bits of news and things happening so recently that it's difficult to kind of see through everything and get to the kind of what are the important things that we need to be thinking about in the future, what are the key things that we can expect. And really, we kind of structured this presentation off the back of those conversations that we've had internally at Thrive, and thinking about the way in which we've been trying to kind of work through that uncertainty. So just three kind of really simple sections that we're going to go through. The first is looking at AI and what we're saying, like the state of play. And that basically means, a bit of an understanding of where we're at right now, but also very much like what's changing at this moment. And then we're going to have a bit of a think about user expectation. And we use user expectation as a way of, I suppose, navigating through some of that uncertainty and understanding where do we think things are going. And then from that, we're going to talk about how we can strategize for AI and how we can take things further forward. So just starting off then with, where have we been at, and what has the focus been? Over the last year, AI has really made a mark as a technology that will have a huge impact on the way that we work, the way that we learn, the way that we do everything. And that's quite a big statement to make. It's also led to a lot of kind of thoughts in terms of, well, should we be talking about AI as a concept, or should we be talking about it as a tool to solve particular problems? In other words, should the emphasis be on the problem, or should the emphasis be on the tool? And I think it's such a revolutionary thing that actually necessarily people are focused on what is this technology and how is it working and what's it doing for us. I think it's really important also to highlight that the tools and the resources that have been coming out have been very much focused on individualistic experiences. So like one person communicating with an AI, and in almost every case, this is kind of focused on the consumer. So we've had tools like ChatGPT, which for 99% of its existence has been focused on an individual working in their personal life, probably, or just being able to interact and experiment with their conversations with a chatbot, effectively. But what we're starting to see right now is some changes in that, which are really going to influence the way that we can start to use it in business. Because of the fact that we've seen that I suppose we've got that legacy and we've got that period in which we've been so focused on consumer type experiences and individual experiences. I think we're now starting to see a lot of reaction to that. So we've kind of highlighted this recent news article here about the BBC blocking ChatGPT. This is just one of a number of similar articles that have been popping up over the course of the last few months. And it's totally understandable as to why, because everything that's going in the public domain, everything that we're kind of sharing with ChatGPT is being used to train it. And similarly, other tools as well, whether we're talking about DALL-E or what other algorithms we're playing with. So, it's kind of understandable that we're seeing this kind of reaction, but it's also really important for us to think about, well, what's going to change there and how can we expect things to move forward?
I think it's just worth digging into some of the stats that we found from a recent piece of research that BlackBerry Limited carried out that kind of dig into that broader concern of, we're really wary of ChatGPT, for example, and how we're going to kind of put restraints around that, but then also counteracting that with the fact that people recognize that there is a huge opportunity for AI, and that there are particular niches. We've called out cybersecurity here on screen that actually also recognize that there's a huge opportunity there, but that's in opposition to those bans that we're seeing. So really interestingly, BlackBerry pulled out that 75% of organizations worldwide are considering or have implemented a ban on ChatGPT. But on the other hand, people are recognizing the opportunity that it has for innovation and for changing the way we approach things like cybersecurity. So there's still that interesting tension, and we'll talk a little bit more about tension and expectations, obviously, as we go through this, as Mark has alluded to, but really worth calling out these stats on screen.
So, I'm getting myself centered again. What's changing? What can we expect to see in terms of what's going to change this narrative? Well, as we look at tools like ChatGPT, so ChatGPT has recently, and we've kind of got a little snippet of this at the bottom, has recently introduced ChatGPT Enterprise. The focus of this is to give a private space for an organization to be able to query, and it might just be a smaller team, or it might be an entire organization that's sharing that. The other key feature that we're seeing kind of emerging from that move is the ability to train the model with information from an organization. And that's always been a big stumbling block for a lot of the learning use cases that we're talking about, because obviously what we want to be able to learn are the ways of working within a business. So that's a big step forward, having that certainty that information will be secure and having the ability to train it on relevant information. It's worth highlighting as well, though, that there is a emerging conflict there, because we can also look at Azure GPT, or we can look at Amazon have just announced that they're launching a similar algorithm on their service that they call Bedrock. These providers have more of an infrastructure approach to AI. In other words, it's the kind of thing that you're going to set up a server for, that kind of approach, and have some kind of a routine that's pushing data towards systems. ChatGPT are envisaging something that's much more straightforward and integrations that come straight out of the box, but maybe less engineering required. Whereas Microsoft, AWS have more of a focus on actually you should be able to train AIs for specific purposes. So even though we're kind of taking a step forward, there's now like another ambiguity that comes up. But at least it's kind of helpful for us to think about the difference between the consumer experience and what we expect organizations to be able to do. I think the other interesting thing in all of this is, despite the fact that we're now starting to look at enterprise solutions with AI, we really are still focused on a similar kind of experience, very much one-on-one. We have an individual who's able to query, much the same as we can do with Google or that kind of thing. Obviously, it's kind of next level, but we're not seeing the benefits in terms of teams being able to collaboratively work together. And that's a really big thing that we think is going to be shaping the way that AI will work within businesses.
And so at this point, it's worth calling out the report that CIPD released at the beginning of the year, which pulls those two things that Mark just mentioned into focus, in that organizations are embracing the use of collaboration with peers. So I'm going to pull out communities here specifically as one of the highest priorities, and that's something that they're currently doing. But then further down the list, we've got things like ChatGPT and artificial intelligence. So there's a real kind of distinction there between those two things. And a huge gap between them. So how are we thinking forward into the future going to be bridging that gap and bringing those two things and experience closer together? So how are we going to see communities being utilized by artificial intelligence or ChatGPT, maybe more specifically? So really interesting kind of future thinking there. So to carry on from that, let's think about what are some of those opportunities, but also potentially what are some of the challenges that we are dealing with at the moment as well. And I think I'm not actually sure whether the animation on this slide is going to have worked or not. So I'll just talk about these quite broadly. And thinking about challenges, I'm going to use the term cautious optimism here and I utilize this quite a lot when I'm speaking about AI, in that the future is bright. It's going to change the way that we operate and fundamentally live within our personal and professional lives. But there's an element of caution. We've all heard people talk about the fear that's associated with AI, and whilst we're not really going to dig into that here, there's an element of caution that comes with how we're going to be utilizing AI in the future. And although I think the future is bright, as I just said, and I am optimistic about it, you have to keep that caution in mind as well. And that's an element of challenge to do that and to think about how it is going to affect the way we work and the way that we live. Ultimately, we also really need to be thinking about how what kind of data you're putting into things like ChatGPT. And that's something that is a challenge, particularly for organizations. And that's the reason lots of organizations have already banned ChatGPT, is because of that uncertainty about the security of the data and the information that's being put into it, and also potentially the lack of awareness through no one's fault of actually what am I putting in and what am I prompting ChatGPT with, and that information then becomes part of the pool of information that ChatGPT is pulling from. So you need to be really aware of IP or confidential information, personal data, that sort of stuff. So it's just something to be aware of when you're utilizing things like this, and just ultimately be conscious and wary of the data that you're putting into it. The other side of this are the opportunities that's bringing. And I think there's a real opportunity here for experimentation and adopting that kind of experimental mindset that we often talk quite a lot about within Thrive. And you can utilize tools to change the way that you do things, the way that you can change your productivity ultimately by utilizing certain tools. So embrace that element of opportunity that's provided to us at the moment to experiment a little bit more. There's also a real opportunity for closer employee listening here. So what do your employees want? What are their expectations? And as I said, we'll dig into that again in a moment. But you have an opportunity here to really think about how AI might already be utilized across your organization. So departments over here might be using a certain tool, while someone else over there might be utilizing something else. So listen to what's going on in your organizations, but also what people need and are requesting as well. And that gives you a real opportunity within your business. Now, alignment kind of falls in between challenges and opportunities here, because I think there is a challenge around alignment of tools, which I've just spoken about there in terms of employee listening. There's also an alignment of what those expectations are for people that are coming into your business who are already there, and what their expectations are for the type of technologies that you're utilizing. So alignment is challenging to do, but is a real opportunity here to kind of lean into that. I think now would be, the animation was working. I should have just clicked through it and saved us all just looking at one slide. Let's take stock with a couple of polls now. So we've run this session a couple of times now, and we have some data that we can share with you all. But it'd be really interesting to see what kind of responses are coming through on the polls in the separate screen that you've got all available. You should all have available, and you should all be able to see that already. So I think the first question is around utilization of AI in your current work. So do you think there is room to upskill, or are you already feeling very confident about it? Do you think you need support, or are you just not interested? I'm not sure we'll have many people falling into that category given the nature of the topic of conversation. But I think it's useful to kind of take stock. And I can see there that there are people there's a mixture of answers, so around kind of feeling confident, or you're wary, but also you want to try but you need support. And I think that is the expectation that we had when we were coming into this, is that there's an element of wariness around these new technologies about the information that you might be putting into it, or how you actually utilize it to improve what you do or to shape the way that you think. And I think that's certainly true of the audiences that we've asked last time. So 69% of people wanted to try AI in their daily work, but they do need support. And I think there's a real opportunity there for L&D teams specifically to think about what it is that they need to be able to do, how they support their people to do it, but also how they're also upskilling themselves in this area as well. So it's something that we know is important to people, but there's just that element of hand-holding that's needed to guide people. And I think that's a responsibility that falls across a range of different people. So the second question we asked was, do you think there will be a generational divide when it comes to expectations for how AI is utilized in businesses? The options here were yes, no, and not sure. And the reason we're asking this question is because there's potentially an opportunity here to think about how you're future-proofing your organization for new generations that are coming into it. So we know that by 2025, 33% of the workforce are going to be made up of Gen Z. And the way that Gen Z, and I'm using broad stereotypes, think is very different to the way that older generations have approached things historically. So I can see from your answers here that 68% of you think there will be a generational divide. But there's also a split between no and not sure here, which I think is quite interesting, because when we ran this poll previously, 84% of people think there'll be a generational divide when it comes to expectations. So I think there's really interesting kind of differences there that are being pulled out. But something to be conscious of, I think, is that those expectations and how people are coming into the workforce does need to be thought about quite carefully in the way that you're approaching new technologies and creating new experiences for people as a result. So I'll just take this moment to talk about a quote that Henry Coutinho Mason, who was someone who joined us at our customer event a couple of weeks ago now. I was going to say last week, but it's probably a couple of weeks, maybe even 3 weeks ago. Thrive ran a customer event that brought people together to think about stuff that's going on outside of the bubble of L&D. And this quote really stood out to me because we live in an expectation economy. That was Henry's statement. And those kind of customer experience expectations are set by the experiences that we create. And it creates a really interesting point of opportunity for us, thinking about what those expectations are, how we create experiences around them, and how that tension is potentially a jumping off point to dig into. So just to summarize that kind of the elements I've just pulled out there, understanding the technology is a start, but user expectations are key to predicting what comes next. And at this point, we were going to play a short video, but I think it's just a static image. So I'll let Mark talk through what was going to happen on screen.
We got this slide, sorry, 1 second. Sorry, everyone. Okay. Sorry, I lost. I can't see what we're doing. Okay, fair enough. We'll leave it on that. So yeah, this is a little video that I can't play you, but it's very short, and it was an advert from AT&T in 1993. I've got a definite thing where I kind of love retro videos that talk about technology, and it's making some really insightful guesses as to what things are going to look like in the future. And it talks about 3 experiences. The first is basically being able to read a book that isn't physically present, and having immediate access to that to kind of show someone in a library. The second is sat-nav, and being able to navigate without needing a map, without needing to kind of ask for directions. And we all can appreciate how much easier that's got over the last few years. And the final one was around kind of being on a beach and being able to get immediate communications with your team wherever you are. So really kind of like valid things that it highlighted. But it's a great example of expectation and the need to think about actually what is that going to look like? What's the reality of that expectation? Because there were little details that they got wrong that I find unnecessarily hilarious. The first one was around the idea of a digital book, very much focused on still having a book which is printed and being able to kind of remotely turn a page, and thinking about still everything being based upon this physical book that was necessary for the experience to happen. Of course, the reality is when you're in a world where, the world that we're in today, we have ebooks. We can store it all digitally. We can have hundreds of books on a little ebook reader, and that's all that we need to carry with us. We don't need a connection. We don't need something on the other end turning a page. So, kind of being anchored and rooted in this experience of today prevented that from being kind of recognized as really what was going to be happening and what the expectations of the user was going to be. I talked about instant communication on the beach. Again, absolutely valid, and being able to communicate wherever we are, but the example that they give is fax. So being able to send a fax from the beach, which I just love, like the fact that no one thought that maybe having a printed bit of paper on the beach might not be too convenient. But again, like, the physical medium being important was something that they found it hard to move beyond. And I think in a lot of the conversations that we're having today about AI, we're probably seeing a similar kind of limitation in terms of us being stuck in our expectations of today and thinking forwards to, okay, well, it's still going to be like that, but it's just going to be more AI-y. Actually, we kind of need to think through that a little bit more and think about what users are really going to expect. So, there's kind of three key expectations in this section that I'm going to just talk through. So these are all things that we have been considering as part of our product design at Thrive, and also helping us to shape some of our R&D projects that we've been working on over the course of the last kind of like 8 months or so. So the first is that users are increasingly expecting tools to offer immediate answers and interactive dialogue. And this is happening today. We can already see a difference in the user experience that we would have on Google versus something like ChatGPT. That difference is best seen in that the answers that we receive from ChatGPT are immediate, and they're actually framed by that technology in the context that the user's asked for. So if I'm talking about food hygiene, I might get back an answer about, just preparing raw meats. But if I'm saying that actually I work with chicken, then the answer will be specifically dealt with chicken, for example. That's a random example to give, but it's one that I've played around with. So it jumped to mind. So I think that contextualization is really key. But the bigger thing is I don't need to click into resources and explore various links in order to try and understand what the answer might be. I don't need to spend time trying to assimilate that knowledge and understand it, because the system is able to understand it for me and describe it to me in a way that works for me. And that's, as I say, an expectation that we're already seeing shifting. So where does that lead us to? Ultimately, this matches up really well to the kind of search paradigm that we have within all of our kind of platforms and systems. Search is something that we're very much used to, but we're going to have to start thinking about search a little bit different and looking at how we can actually get more answers out of the system immediately. So here, I need some coaching. Are you aware of the Grow coaching method? This is something that we think will, there's definitely more of a tendency to ask full length questions now. And you can see that rather than focusing on the search page offering a list of results, we're into the search page giving us a direct answer, and also having the opportunity to further discuss that with the system and pull out more details, and maybe provide more context to the question. We're going to come back to this example in a little bit as well, because this is very light touch, but it takes us somewhere else, which is really interesting. But I'm going to come back to that in a little moment. The next thing that we think, it's probably a little bit further out, but we really believe that an expectation will shift around how much a learner needs to be informing a system about what they want to learn. And we believe, and we're seeing evidence, that learners are expecting more intelligence and more support in terms of the paralysis of choice. On a system where you've got thousands of people working together and knowledge items from across an organization, there's a lot of skills represented there. There's a lot of information to be held and to be accessed. And many learners access that and feel that they don't know the best goal for themselves to set, the next thing that they want to upskill themselves on. And so actually they've got a I don't know what I don't know type question, which can be quite difficult to deal with. And obviously that puts more weight then on managers and experts to be able to guide those people and mentor them. But with AI, we're expecting there to be an increase in the way that systems can provide recommendations, but also guide people on that journey. And so just in terms of like active mentoring, we have projects at the moment where we're researching having the ability to generate goal suggestions. So not just, okay, so you want to learn something about becoming a proficient user researcher, as in the top example, therefore here are the tasks and the tasks and the content that you might want to look at. But going beyond that and actually getting the idea out in the first place and saying, well, based upon your activity, based upon your team, based upon your role, based upon what we're seeing other people doing, and just generally based upon information that's available across the internet, we can suggest 2, 3, 4 things that you might want to go and have a look at. And the better that those suggestions are, the quicker that people are going to be able to kind of go, okay, actually, let's plot that journey out. Let's start moving forward with that. And so then moving to a place where we've got our goals automatically being filled out as well, so automatically finding the content that's relevant. And this is something that has been really exciting, experimenting with this, using AI to generate recommended tasks, ways in which people can demonstrate their understanding and their competence in a skill. AI is super creative, and it's really good at coming up with assessment strategies. And so actually that's another way in which we can really ease the burden in terms of giving people a route forward and saying, hey, here's a thing that you could do. There's a question, I'm going to answer this on the side actually, there's a question that's come through about kind of hallucination and AI generating things that are maybe not valid, and we're going to come back to that in just a moment. But the one thing I would say on that front is when we're in the realm of asking AI to suggest a task or something that could be done, actually that minimizes its opportunity to kind of give wrong information, because we're not asking it for a yes/no answer. We're not asking for something that is true or false. We're asking for something that someone could do in order to demonstrate something. And it's pretty good at doing those things. There are certain topics and particular areas that I suppose it starts producing long lists of do this, things that are very procedural. It gets very wordy, but beyond that, actually, it's really good at generating these kinds of little snippets and tasks. So, final expectation. We've talked about 2 already. This is the 3rd one, and again, a little bit further out again, but we believe that learners will begin to expect tools to be more empathetic and aware of circumstances. Now, when we talk about personalization at the moment in the tools that we work with in our industry, personalization is normally based upon demographics. So effectively, you're in this population. Maybe you work in this pattern and you work in this region and you've got this job title. Therefore, these things are going to be relevant to you. And that's perfectly legitimate in terms of personalization. We've done some good stuff there. But I think when we talk about AI, it's a little bit easy to just think about it as a machine. But if we look at some of the biggest concerns that have been raised about AI, it's actually about the emotional bond that people can form with it, the way in which people can kind of find those experiences to be very intense, for example. And that's something that is challenging. We kind of need to think about how we deal with that. But it's also something that highlights the potential for AI to be genuinely empathetic and understand a little bit about the work that people are doing and their daily lives, and then recommend things based upon that in a truly individual way. So there's an example that I've shared here that is really based on something that I've done. Maybe I'm kind of public speaking at a particular event. The AI has the potential to ask me questions about what's going on and actually remember that I have a particular event coming up at a particular time. And then based upon that, time a response back to me, not there and then at the immediate moment, but come back and say, well, actually, I think you said that you had an event you were speaking at. How did that go? Or something along those lines. And I think that this is going to open the door for us to offer different kinds of learning experiences, prompting us to reflect, but also giving us the opportunity to maybe assess whether or not someone has understood something or how they've performed in a particular situation. And so, this is all very, very different to the way that we envisage experiences today. And I think that expectation piece, you can really see how that would be changing rapidly in a world where we're able to do something along these lines. So I'm going to move on to.
I think it's just worth actually answering one of the questions that's come up in the chat with this on screen. So Mark Levag, sorry if I mispronounced your surname, has asked around how we can use AI to create more equitable and inclusive learning experiences. And I think this is a really good example of where AI can be utilised to make something like coaching more equitable across a business, because currently some of the demands on individuals' time. So if you have the fortunate position to have an internal coach or access to an external coach, there's a certain amount or a certain population of people who will have that immediate access. So actually bringing AI in this situation actually creates the opportunity to make that experience more equitable for your business. So we might come back to that again at the end, but I thought it was worth touching on here because equitable learning experiences are useful.
I'm also going to just dig into one of the questions, sorry, while we're here. So David O'Neill has asked, pardon me, if I can talk. When you say AI is really good at coming up with assessment strategy or recommending a learning task, are you talking about models specifically trained or something generic like ChatGPT? So I wouldn't necessarily say AI is good at coming up with strategies, because strategy is big picture, multiple steps. AI tends to be good at specific tasks. And yes, we've experimented with a number of different prompts and ways of setting context that allows a generic algorithm like GPT 3.5 or GPT-4 is actually really good at it, giving a bit of information about the organization, a little bit of information about the role that someone's doing, and then the challenges maybe that they're facing. And then from there asking, okay, I would like to think of ways that I could demonstrate an understanding of. And we found that works really well for a number of roles, particularly where the roles are, I suppose, I'm trying to think how to describe this. So I suppose you're talking about knowledge pieces, so being able to get out of them whether or not they understand something, if we're talking in those terms. Where it starts to break down is where things are highly procedural. So, for example, if I say, how do I give me a task that would demonstrate that I understand how to medicate someone. Well, medication, that requires you to follow a 10-step procedure. So there isn't a way around that. You have to be able to demonstrate all 10 of those steps. So really hard for it to kind of give a very short answer to that. Whereas something more specific and bite-sized, it's able to give really good recommendations for. So yeah, that's something that I would encourage you to experiment with. It's really good.
So I think it's useful here to then think about how we begin to strategize for AI and some of the things that we can start thinking about now that will have a real impact on the way that we can utilize AI or prepare for it in the future as well. And one of those things is around the way that we actually create content for AI. So at the moment, what we see are multiple different types of resources that are available to you in different formats. So obviously SCORM, PDFs, videos, things like that. But actually at the moment, what you need to put into a large language model like ChatGPT is often very text-based. So the information that you want to supply to your large language model will have to be text-based at the beginning. So shifting what your expectations are for how you're creating that content in the first place. So something like having a PDF like the one on screen that's a full document, as you can see on screen, actually shifting that to just the text and how the ChatGPT or whatever it is that you're using will then pull information from that in order to inform its answers. So there's a shift in thinking, I think, that is required there. But then also on the other side of that, there's the opportunity to utilize policy and procedure documents in a way that maybe we haven't really done within organizations before. So they're kind of there as the backbone of what we do within an organization, but they're not something that people really would go away and read in full detail and spend a long time looking at, although I'm sure some people would wish that they did. But there's the opportunity there to put that information as a very kind of foundational level of information for an organization into a large language model that can then utilize the chatbot interface to pull from that information and dig into it in more detail. But there's also, actually, before we move on to that one, there's also the opportunity, I think, to then shift our thinking away from skills that are utilized, I guess skills at speed over expert level knowledge. So there's the opportunity to think about how you actually gain knowledge and information. And I guess kind of YouTube is a really good example of this, in that you, and we talk about this in our implementation of our platforms, when we talk about this with our customers, is how do you actually go away and find the answer to a problem that you may have? And often that is, you go and ask people in your organization, or if you're at home, you go and ask one of your family members, or you look it up on the internet, you might watch a video. And so you're quickly gaining information that can change the way you react to a situation and allow you to carry out a task really easily. And the way that we think about skills at the moment is that kind of expert lens. You are upskilling towards being an expert at something. And potentially this leans into the question we were answering before around equitable learning experiences, that everyone has the opportunity to upskill and put things into practice really quickly, utilizing tools like AI in order to do that. So I think there's a shift in expectation for how we actually upskill and change our thinking and language around upskilling as a result of that as well.
Okay, so the kind of next thing that we want to kind of get people thinking about really is around the decreased need for catalogue information. And I suppose that's a bit of how do we describe what that means? My observation from the years that I've worked in this industry is that I think we catalogue stuff a lot. We create large content libraries with articles, videos, PDFs, e-learning modules that answer all of the questions that we can think of. And the bigger that is, the better. And we're very much focused on that being a knowledge resource for our organization and for our teams. Similarly, though, we also, if we look at skills, for example, the approach for skills up until very recently actually has been, let's have a catalogue of as many hundreds of thousands of skills as we can possibly have. And I've talked before about, when we're looking at a data set from 2017, the US, maybe based on particular industries, we're going to see biases in terms of the way that skills are worded and the way that skills are understood that maybe don't sit well with the team that we're working with. And these kinds of problems exist when we're cataloging and we're creating things in that way. AI gives us a way to kind of move past that and actually genuinely understand what individuals are talking about a little bit better. Skills are probably a really good one to talk about here. Again, if I'm talking about color theory, that can mean one thing to a person who is painting a room and a different thing to someone who is kind of creating a website. Just one phrase, but two different ways of interpreting that, two ways of kind of grouping and saying these are related skills, etc., etc. And the key to understanding that is context. And AI is able to take that context. We can provide it with contextual statements. We can provide it with information about the individual. And from there, kind of we move on. Now, what that means is actually, in many ways, we're going to start reshaping our mindsets to, instead of be focused on how can I create as much content as possible to be able to answer all of the questions, the focus will become how do I make sure that an AI gives valid answers, and how do I make sure that I'm happy with that? How do I also highlight when maybe we're not so sure about it? So one of the questions that's already come in from Marco is, AI blatantly hallucinating. I touched on this earlier on. I said I'd come back to it. If you have an AI and you're relying on it to generate answers, you have not got 100% confidence as to whether or not that answer is going to be right. But if we just take a step back for a moment and think about what the model is today, how we work today, a system like Thrive allows people to ask questions. It also allows people to search. So we can search, we can look and see whether or not something's been asked before. We can look and see whether there's an article that answers that. If there isn't, then we can post a question and we can wait and ask for an expert to kind of answer that for us. But it is a very kind of slow process compared to what's possible with something like ChatGPT. What I think that means is that we'll see a shift and we'll see that kind of being stitched together a little bit more. So instead of us kind of starting with a search and then we'll start with a question, AI will give us a first stab at that answer. And the question will be whether or not our tools are able to kind of differentiate between something that we've got a confident response on and something that maybe needs to be kind of looked at by an expert, and giving that option and making it really easy. So actually, I'll just go back for a second. If we're on this slide, we've actually got a concept within Thrive today, which is called endorsement. Endorsement is a way of saying, this is good. We know that it's the right information and it's official. And we're working on mechanisms that allow us to say, actually, we're happy that this response has been tailored and it's been trained, and that if you ask this question, then you're going to be getting the right answer. And where that happens, you'll get a little endorsement sticker next to it. So we're using concepts that are already kind of at play and already relevant, but applying that to AI. And then from there, when we look at asking an expert a question, we still want to be able to support that experience. We still want to be able to leverage that knowledge, but we don't expect people to kind of go and create a thing in order to get that answer. And so we're looking at how we can stitch those experiences together. Again, we wouldn't really expect that people are being asked more questions than they were before, but our focus now is on how do we train the AI to give reliable responses and also vet those responses, rather than how do we generate a catalogue of answers. It's similar things, but slightly different. And I think that's another way of us kind of looking at this cataloguing. How can we really take advantage of that being as kind of dynamic as it is? If we kind of take it one more step back, there's another example that I wanted to give before I moved on from this, which is around looking at kind of our courses, the idea of a course, something that we sit through for maybe half an hour. It's a SCORM package. We put effort into, all of that instructional design and all the rest of it. If we want to create a translated version of that, we have to separately produce those. If we want to personalize it and make it relevant to the particular role, maybe manual handling, you've got some people working with ladders a lot, you've got other people working with shelves, I don't know. But to personalize it is another level of complexity and really hard to do. When we're in the world where we're talking about prompts being generated automatically with an understanding of context, we can shift the tone of voice automatically as we generate those responses. We can shift the language that we're generating those responses in, all based upon some core knowledge that's been provided in a single standard format. So our ability to respond to the needs of the learner grows exponentially according to the kind of way in which we're dynamically generating these responses. So I think there will be much more of that going on in the future, because there's so many benefits to it.
There's also, I think someone asked on the chat earlier, I can't see the question on the screen at the moment, but around what type of skills we need to accommodate AI and think about AI as L&D teams in the future. And this, I think, is a real opportunity here to think about how lateral thinking, I think, is going to be a skill that people need to, I guess, get better at, or critical thinking potentially, rather than lateral thinking, in that whatever AI produces, you need to be able to think critically about what information it's actually providing to you. So there is an onus, I think, on individuals assessing the information and the output that's coming out of that, obviously leaning into verifying that with somebody if you need to. But there's a challenge around that, and particularly if you're doing it at scale. But I think it's quite easy for L&D teams to think that everyone is going to think critically about the outputs that are coming out of things like this. But actually, a lot of the time, people do take things at face value. So something to think about there as we head into the future of this for organizations. So just to summarise, and we're going to head into a section for Q&A now, we have answered a few of the things that are on screen, so hopefully there will be a few more coming through as well. So if you do have questions, please do feel free to be putting them in the chat, and we'll get to them in a minute. But just to sum up, ultimately, analysing the present to shape the future requires the human to be placed front and centre of that. And hopefully that's come through in everything that we've spoken about today in terms of what those expectations are of your people within your organisation currently, the new generations that are coming into the workforce as well, and how people can utilise a system to get the best out of it, to rapidly upskill, or to have those more coaching-based conversations. Ultimately, there's that element of the human that is at the core of what we're doing here, which I think is really useful to always remind ourselves, particularly when we're looking at artificial intelligence. So, happy to open the floor to Q&A, and we'll see what comes through, and hopefully some of the things that we've resonated today have sparked a little bit of curiosity and interest, and obviously we'll both be happy to follow up with anyone after this. So I'll just wait and see what comes through.
Some fabulous questions coming through and chat as well. The chat's been banging backwards and forwards, and conversations been going on as well, and so we do have some questions. I've picked some of them up already, but if I can't get to all of them, apologies. We've got one here from Louise Rowland, where at the very start, so this is quite early in, you were talking about that you hadn't seen the benefits yet of collaboration, communities utilising AI, ChatGPT. You mentioned some of the use cases, but particularly around communities, how do you think this might work?
You might, the community aspect, I'm not sure whether or not I'm going to provide a great example of that, so you have to think about that. But so for me, the thing I'm really focused on is like teams, which is a kind of community. And I think we have all kinds of models at the moment for providing feedback to one another. 360 feedback is like obviously the main one, and that's very formalized as a kind of like, okay, we're going to have this form and we're going to fill that out. I think when we're in a place where we've got a dialogue, on ChatGPT today, you've already got the concept of a conversation, and those conversations stack up on the left, and it's the same with Bard and other systems. But if you open that up to being a dialogue between the AI and multiple people, then actually that topic is something that more than one person could feed into. So for example, my conversation with the AI that I demonstrated was actually very one-on-one still. I've told it that I'm going to do a talk, and it's come back and asked me a question about how I felt it went. But there's nothing actually that prevents us from having a conversation with my manager or with someone else who was at that event in order to say, how did you think Mark did? Any feedback for him or anything along those lines? So it's really just the same as 360 feedback, but done in a much more informal way, and something that people will feel fitting into their normal daily lives much more straightforwardly. So that's the kind of thing that I think we will see coming through a bit more on the community front.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting opportunity here, particularly. So I run a community called Women In, which connects people from across the L&D and HR fields. And a particular use case that's at the back of my mind is how you delve into some of the subjects that are used in the discussion, and people kind of utilize the group for particular ideas around kind of how do you create a leadership program, or how do you make coaching more equitable across the business. They come to the community to ask questions, and a lot of the time that information is already probably been asked in a previous chat. So I think there's an opportunity there to actually utilize the conversation that's happening as your data source for AI to kind of pull out those key points, essentially. And that, as far as I know, isn't currently happening, but if it is, let me know. I think it's a real opportunity there to utilize people's knowledge as the source of the conversation starter at that point, which kind of flips it on its head slightly.
Yeah, thank you. You picked up already, Helen, the question from Ramon about critical skill set you need as an L&D professional to utilise AI for your work. He followed it up with, but how would you train or learn or develop that in a safe way? What are your thoughts about how you could learn how to develop your skill set around using AI? What are your thoughts on that?
I think there's something in this around question asking. So that kind of, it comes off the back of conversations that you might be having with your team members, but digging into asking the right questions more often, or continuing to ask questions. and that will enable you to, particularly thinking there around critical thinking, is, are you getting what you expected out of the situation? And to verify that, I think you start asking, I mean, we talk about the 5 whys a lot, but you start asking whether it's the right kind of thing that's being output there. So yeah, I think my first point of call would be asking questions, or leaning in, and then leaning into the people around you as well. So not taking away that human element of feedback in terms of what you're learning as well. I don't know if you've got anything to add, Matt.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky one. The reality is, with where the technology is at today, it's hard to bring it into an operational capacity within your team or within your business. Like, there will be edge cases, but in most cases it's still a little bit too early. But it's getting there. Like, the rate at which it's evolving is extremely rapid, and I think there are already use cases where we can kind of look at, okay, well, what's taking a lot of time within our organization, within our teams, and when we get to a place where this is available for our managers, for our teams, like, how could this support? And so that's, we talked a little bit about kind of task setting and that kind of stuff. That's very much where my journey started in terms of tinkering and playing things around. It's like, well, actually, someone's already doing this, but it takes them a while to think about that. How could I maybe ask a question in a way that's going to get it to kind of generate a response that saves me a lot of time? And actually, the key thing there is save it, because when you find a structure to a question that you can ask, and you can provide it with context in a particular point, and you find that gives you good results, that's the magic sauce. Then that's the thing that you can just keep on doing. And yeah, it's a really good way of working.
And interesting. So a really interesting point that Liz has come up in the chat as well is that companies need to have a policy on it as well. I would actually take it further and say, actually, you need to think about, and do you know what, plan for it. If you ignore it, you've got a problem. You have to build it into your learning strategy. You have to build it into your policies. It's going back to your point about policy. You have to, I don't like using the word legislate for it, but you have to take it into account, because it's going to be here. So
yeah, I agree. And I think within that as well, there's at the moment, there's a tendency for it to be a little bit banned or unbanned. There's no grey area in the middle, and there needs to be a consideration of, these are the things that are absolutely banned. These are the things that you can use, but you can't use operationally, and you can't provide it with any company information whatsoever, but you can try things out with it. And then here is stuff that actually we've tested, we've experimented, we've got the documentation, we're happy that we can do what we need to do with it. And yeah, information security is a big thing around this. We've all got personal information that we want to protect. It's too difficult and too obscure to know whether or not a given AI provider is using your data to train their system. That has to be audited and kind of gone through. So yeah, having that list of approved and audited suppliers is a really good thing.
I think it's also really interesting that the financial services sector are the primary source of bans on ChatGPT, because of that nature of wanting things to be quite black and white, but also that they also see the opportunity in AI to change the way you approach things like cybersecurity, which we mentioned at the beginning. So having that kind of the policy that kind of safeguards people and ring fences like what you can and can't do with it, whilst allowing an element of flexibility in terms of experimentation, I think is something that, and I'm sorry if there's anyone from the financial services sector on the webinar, but it's something that they generally have struggled with, is that ambiguity of information. So yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see whether once it becomes more policy driven or ring fenced, whether the financial services sector kind of loosen that hold a little bit. So it'll be interesting to watch that develop.
Excellent. Flicking back to my other questions. So this was from Edwin. It says, an operational manager in previous life, it'll be interesting to see whether these tools are used to try and replace roles rather than helping to enhance the key ones. More statement than a question.
It's obviously,
how do you think? Yeah, let's throw it out there. What are your thoughts on that?
It's obviously a big area of concern for a lot of people. And I think that our first evidence of this, and what we're seeing we're able to do right now, is to automate the stuff that no one has time for. So a good example of that is generating an assessment to understand whether someone's got a skill. I've used that example a few times, apologies. But actually, if you're talking about skills that are emerging within an organization, it could be that it's a tool that has only just come on the market and loads of people want to know how to use it. Who's got time to jump in and create all of these assessments to understand whether or not, and all of that kind of content. And so what we're really seeing the first kind of push being is to enable us to do new things that were not possible before because no one had the time to do them. That's probably the best way to put it. And therefore those things would have had a huge cost previously. Now they have next to no cost. I think that I can't remember where I read it or where I heard this, but someone was talking about AI as something that can replace jobs and what they expected the first jobs to be that would go versus the things that have actually been causing problems. And he was talking about who would have thought that creatives and artists would be the ones most under threat, when actually you can kind of think about all kinds of things that are very procedural in nature, and you'd think that those would be the first to get replaced. The truth is that anything that requires you to do a variety of tasks and stitch them together in a particular way that gets you to an end result, AI is not great at that. And it's probably always going to be a little bit challenging for the kinds of algorithms that we're talking about today anyway. Versus a specific thing, I'm going to produce a specific thing. That actually is something that AI can compete at. But even then, it needs that human involvement. So I think certainly with the level of technology that we're talking about right now, it's easier for it to be used to automate the stuff that no one wants to do than it is for it to do the jobs that we're all doing and adding value through today. But obviously, it's a changing landscape. Some of you got any thoughts on that?
No, that was a good summary.
Okay.
Questions from Anesh. The data that AI trains on can inadvertently and potentially advertently as well make it biased. How do we detect them and resolve that?
Starting with detection is a really good one, because detection is probably the most tricky one. In terms of the resolution, we need models, and we need mechanisms within our tools that allow us to highlight particular scenarios and say, an obvious one is employees. Lots of organizations use different words for employees, and that's quite a contentious thing in some cases. And so you've got to get that language right. It's really important for the kind of culture of the organization. So being able to teach an AI, look, when you're talking about employees, don't ever say that, say this instead. And again, that's part of the kind of context building that you provide to these algorithms. And at a more advanced level, then you can use those same mechanisms to train it out of particular biases that you've noticed. But the problem with detection is certainly the big one. And I think that's a key thing in terms of, I suppose, our kind of user acceptance testing phase, actually trying out these tools and seeing what we can recognize. But I think also we as an industry, and all of us as organizations as well, we need to contribute in a holistic way to identifying those and making sure that we're kind of training those systems out of doing that kind of thing.
I'd agree. And I think taking that kind of step back outside of how you might be utilizing AI within a tool within your business, if you're just utilizing it in your daily lives, having that kind of awareness to think, what is this saying? And this comes back to the critical thinking that we spoke about earlier. What is it actually saying? And is there any element of bias in existence in that? Obviously, you're then dealing with your own unconscious bias as well. So it's an interesting kind of how do you deal with both of those things? But you can teach ultimately ChatGPT what was good and what was not about an answer that was given. So you have that opportunity. And Andrew, I actually think you did a really good experiment on this recently, where you noticed that you'd asked a question of AI, of ChatGPT. It answered a certain way, and I can't remember off the top of my head, so you might be able to explain it, but it answered in a certain way 6 months ago.
Yeah, it's the 10 philosopher question. So you ask ChatGPT, name 10 philosophers, and earlier in the year it will give you 10 white Western men. And if you ask, so I've literally, while we've been here, I've been asked the question of Bard. I've name 10 famous philosophers, and it's given me Confucius, Lao Tzu, so it's given me some people who aren't necessarily Western. It's also added Simone de Beauvoir for the list now as well, so I've got a woman in there. It's still not as diverse as you would want it to be, but it's beginning to pick that up. However, we have to constantly test the systems to make sure that we can challenge that stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
We run out of time. we've got more questions, but there's some fabulous questions in here, but we just haven't got the time to answer them now, unfortunately. Thank you, everybody, for your contributions again. These sessions only work if people are engaging with them, and the chat has been flying about. You guys, you're going to have to look at the chat. I know you're busy today, but you're going to have to check back in and have a look at the chat and see what's going on. If they want to contact you, people will be able to get hold of you through LinkedIn, I assume, yeah?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Excellent stuff. The chat box remains open, so even after the session's finished, you can still put your comments and questions in there. I know that Helen and Mark will be heading there, so leaves me with nothing to say other than massive thank you to you both. Thank you to Helen Marshall and Mark Ward from Thrive, and we'll look to see you again at our next session this afternoon. Thank you, everybody. Take care and have a good afternoon.